Hello, and welcome to the second part of this video about Charles Hallé. At the end of the last video, we saw how because of the revolution of 1848, Halle left Paris to start a new life in London. And just like in Paris, he soon became an ambassador for the music of Beethoven. His first concert at Covent Garden, with Michael Costa conducting, being with Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. Halle was also the first pianist to play the full cycle of Beethoven sonatas in England. He soon became friends with Edward John Sartoris and his wife. They were very much music patrons of the arts, and through them Halle met many poets, artists, and other musicians. Now, we need to talk a little bit about the musical life in London at the time. First of all, there were no permanent orchestras, not as we know them today. Musicians were employed as needed on a per-service basis. Furthermore, in general, until well into the 20th century, the musicians were rarely present at all of their rehearsals, often sending deputies instead. That was usually because they would be engaged elsewhere at the same time. And that's if there even were any rehearsals at all, with many concerts having little or no rehearsal. The conductors themselves were little more than just beat keepers. Michael Costa, which we mentioned before, an Italian conductor now settled in London, being among the first to resemble more sort of a modern conductor. He was a disciplinarian concerned with new ideas like the orchestral balance, for example. There was no orchestra comparable in quality with the German orchestras or with the Paris Conservatoire Orchestra. Most of the popular concerts consisted of performances of oratorios or promenade concerts of light music. In fact, there was no such a thing as a season of concerts, certainly not throughout the entire year. There was nothing like a chamber music series, and anything remotely similar was available only to a very exclusive audience. In terms of music education, there were many local teachers, especially organists. By now, too, the Royal Academy of Music had been established, but it wasn't considered yet to be on a par with similar institutions abroad, and many promising British musicians were still advised to further their studies in Germany, France, or Italy. Most of the best instrumentalists were foreign immigrants looking for new financial opportunities. And if that was the state of affairs in London, outside London it was far worse, with most people having never heard a concerto or a symphony before. However, at the same time, and in the spirit of the Industrial Revolution, there was a growing appetite for progress, change, and reform, and an increasing number of musicians and arts entrepreneurs saw that as a situation with huge potential. Throughout the winter of 1848, beginning to struggle financially again, with not many concerts taking place during the autumn and winter months, Halle considered settling in Bath. However, Herman Leo, a wealthy businessman from Manchester, whom Halle had already met a number of times, suggested on behalf of many lovers of music that he came to Manchester instead. After several discussions, Halle decided to give it a go, but with two conditions. One, that they would arrange for a considerable number of students he could start to teach as soon as he arrived to Manchester, and two, that he could spend the summer months in London so that he would keep his connections there as well as an active presence on the musical scene. The idea of educating and forming the musical taste of such a large community became very appealing to him. However, after hearing the only orchestra performing in Manchester at the time for the gentlemen's concerts, he almost ran away in fear and abandoned the whole project. The orchestra was far inferior even to those orchestras he heard in London. But it was pointed out to him, though, that that was precisely the purpose of his settling in Manchester: educating and forming both musicians and audiences. Audiences which, to his disappointment, weren't even able to appreciate somebody as great as his friend Chopin on his only visit to Manchester. He soon embraced that mission fully and tirelessly, though. Furthermore, he really wanted to make music and concerts accessible to everyone, not just the privileged. In contrast, for example, to the chamber music concerts organized by John Ella in London, under the name of the Musical Union, or later the so-called popular concerts. Those were very much exclusivist events, only for the very rich. They were run by an aristocratic committee, as social gatherings for which membership could only be obtained by personal invitation. Halle started first a series of chamber music concerts in Manchester. 67 people subscribed at first, but only 3 attended the first concert. That was the scale of the challenge he faced. However, gradually the interest grew, and more concerts were organized, the demand soon overtaking the capacity. The exact pattern was repeated as he extended his chamber music series to Liverpool as well. Less than 10 people in the audience were at the first concert, but gradually growing like in Manchester. The success was due in part to the fact that Halle managed to invite to Manchester some of the most prominent musicians at the time. For example, the famous violinists Ernst, Vieuxtemps, Molik, or Alfredo Piatti, the cellist. In 1857, a major arts exhibition was taking place in Manchester, in which over 12,000 art pieces were on display. The committee organizing it decided that quality music was needed to accompany the exhibition with daily concerts. Charles Hallé was soon employed to form and organize a first-rate orchestra for that purpose, as it was agreed that the improvised orchestra playing at the gentlemen's concerts was not up to standard. Large amounts of money were provided, and Halle could afford to engage renowned musicians from all over Europe, from Germany, from France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, etc., in addition to some of the very best local players, to form the new temporary orchestra. The concerts became an attraction in themselves, with many of the exhibition visitors never having heard the symphony before. Following the success and the publicity this major artistic event generated all over the north, Halle decided not to disband the orchestra, but to keep it going on his own and at his own risk, with the ultimate dream, as I mentioned before, of providing good quality music at affordable prices for the general public and not only for a few privileged private subscribers. Also, in contrast to the way most concerts were usually run in London, for example, Halle wanted concert tickets put on sale in addition to the usual subscriptions, and detailed concert programs printed and advertised well in advance. Fortunately, the newly built Free Trade Hall was available, and after some negotiating, the Halle Orchestra's first concert took place on the 30th of January 1858. This was a very risky and challenging plan financially. And in fact, within a couple of years, everything almost came to a stop. Charles Hallé writes, "My friends were debating whether for the sake of my family I ought not to be locked up, and I myself began to feel uneasy." However, gradually by 1862, the orchestra concerts began to turn a small profit. Very instrumental in the establishment and the running of the orchestra were the Forsyth brothers, who came to Manchester to help at Charles Halle's invitation. James Forsyth, in fact, became the orchestra business manager, keeping the accounts, paying the orchestra, selling tickets for concerts, and supplying musicians through the music shop. The music shop, which is still open and active these days too, by the way, and which the musicians in the orchestra still use. In 1899, 4 years after Charles Halle's death, the Forsyth brothers became administrators of the orchestra on behalf of the newly formed Halle Concert Society, and the Forsyth Music Shop became the orchestra offices until after the Second World War. Furthermore, until the Royal Manchester College of Music was established, the Forsyth Music Shop was also the place where each week up to 600 lessons of music were given. Something that continued in fact even after the establishment of the new music college. Orchestra auditions were held there too. Even John Barbirolli still held auditions there. And speaking of the Royal Manchester College of Music, Charles Hallé had a determinant role in the establishment of the new music college and became its first principal in 1893. Throughout all this time, Halle continued to tour and perform abroad, as well as, of course, ran a busy schedule of regular concerts in Manchester. While in Vienna, he spent a highly enjoyable week in the company of Brahms. Most importantly, though, he introduced audiences to a lot of music previously unknown to them, while raising performance standards to the highest levels. Before the establishment of the Halle Orchestra, there was no orchestra in the entire country that could attain such high-quality concerts on a regular basis. After Max Bruch resigned, in 1883, Halle took over as principal conductor of the Liverpool Philharmonic as well, until the end of his life. When Bruch was in Liverpool, there was a certain animosity between the two, mostly because of a fear of poaching each other's musicians. In an earlier letter, Max Bruch had in fact written that on his arrival to Liverpool, he found a quality choir, but not really an orchestra, and instead musicians were engaged as needed a number of times per year, mostly from within Halle's Manchester Orchestra. When Herman Leo asked him to come to Manchester, it was so he could help educate musicians and educate and form an audience for music. By the end of his life, Manchester had an orchestra of a standard comparable to the best in Europe, had a music college, chamber music series, choral societies, and oversubscribed concerts. Most of that because of the musicianship, the enthusiasm, and the tireless energy of Charles Hallé. His role in the musical development of this country and its musical life, in general, cannot be overestimated. The great progress made on the musical scene, in the north of England in particular, gave him much satisfaction. In 1891, he wrote that the district is as musical as it is populous. I have the best reason to know, for my Manchester Orchestra concerts are now nearing the end of their 37th consecutive season. With a population of 6 million souls, a large percentage of which is musically inclined, there has often been heard a rumble of dissatisfaction that provision for the proper cultivation of music was so inadequate. True, there was an abundance of good local teaching, but there was nothing in the nature of systematic training obtainable nearer than the metropolis. The advance made in England since my arrival nearly 50 years ago had been incalculably great, and in the big manufacturing towns of the north, especially the interest taken in the higher forms of classical music, such as the symphony and the concerto, was so genuine and discriminating that it was a matter for regret that there was no possibility of rightly developing so much native talent. Even among audiences composed chiefly of artisans and miners, I had again and again been struck by the keen discernment of good and bad. In the cultivation of choral music, I had nowhere met their equals. On the 25th of October 1895, after dinner and following a rehearsal at the Free Trade Hall, Charles Hallé died. It came as a shock to everyone. His coffin was carried on a gun carriage through the streets of Manchester, lined with thousands of people, flags flying at half-mast. His orchestra and the choir playing and singing some of his beloved music at his funeral. I'm going to finish this video by reading a small paragraph from Michael Kennedy's book, The Halle Tradition. Only a man of remarkable personality could have undertaken this splendid pioneering work. Halle was perhaps the least vain, most self-effacing musician to occupy a conductor's rostrum. His letters and diaries reveal a character of extraordinary charm, kindliness and humor, enjoying a contented and happy family life with the children whom he adored. With his orchestra, his relationship was that of a close rapport, as can be seen from the player's length of service. Thank you for watching.